Hello, everyone, and welcome to this live panel discussion hosted by Umbrella Alliance US. Today, we'll be discussing grief and healing in neurodivergent individuals, breaking down barriers regarding grief, and discussing strategies in navigating grief. We are defining grief as a deep sorrow, an intense emotion over the loss of something or someone, often, but not always, associated with the loss of life. We chose this topic as grief can present differently in neurodivergent individuals and can be difficult to navigate. It might also be challenging to set boundaries or develop positive coping mechanisms for grieving neurodivergence. Today, we wanted to provide an opportunity for you, the viewers, to participate in this discussion as our panelists discuss grief. We invite you to actively participate in the comments section. All comments will be valued and considered as we continue to work towards our future success. We want to remind everyone that we invite different perspectives and opinions, and we ask that everyone remember that we are all at different levels of knowledge and experience. We can have positive and compassionate discussions, even when we do not necessarily agree. Now, I am pleased to introduce our moderator, Selena Gavin.
Hi, my name is Selena Gavin, and like Ben just previously said, I will be your moderator slash host this evening for our discussion on grief and the neurodivergent individual. I'd like to introduce myself first, tell you a little bit of background. I am a certified school psychologist in the state of Pennsylvania. Currently, I work as a prevention-based programming specialist, and that is at the John F. Kennedy Center Community Center here in Erie, Pennsylvania. So just to put that all like in a little nutshell, basically what I do at the community center is I work with children in grades K through 12, and I teach them coping mechanisms that are appropriate and that are positive and that do not involve them turning to drugs and alcohol. So anything to keep them from turning to drugs and alcohol as a coping mechanism. So anger management, critical thinking errors, as well as career and academic and peer mentoring. So that's a little bit about me. Now let's get on with the discussion tonight. Our panelists today will be and are Precious Leslie, Marissa Linderman, and Gina Schultz. Each of these individuals comes to the table with experience and expertise in various areas of life, professions, work, play, you name it. We look forward to hearing what each of you have to say. So first of all, I'd like to say hello, humans, because I do not want to mess up and say the wrong pronoun. So everyone is just going to be a human tonight. I hope that's cool. All right. Marissa, I would like for you to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marissa Linderman. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white woman with red hair and brown eyes, and I am the Director of Advocacy at Unsilenced. Unsilenced is a nonprofit organization that serves past, present, and future victims of institutional child abuse. Unsilenced's mission is to stop institutional child abuse by empowering self-advocates to create lasting social change. Unsilenced envisions a world where youth are free from institutionalization and the voices of young people are respected in the development of their mental, emotional, and physical well being. I am a neurodivergent survivor of institutional child abuse within the troubled teen industry. The troubled teen industry is a network of underregulated and powerful congregate care facilities that claim to reform struggling youth with mental health or educational challenges, but use tough love and other non evidence based interventions. These programs include, but are not limited to, therapeutic boarding schools, behavior modification programs, foster care facilities, residential treatment centers, boot camps, conversion camps, religious facilities, wilderness camps, and juvenile justice facilities. In my work, I advocate for evidence based and trauma informed care and lift up the voices of those who are silenced, as well as helping shut down the pipelines to abusive congregate care facilities within the troubled teen industry. It's an honor to be on this panel, and I am so grateful to be a part of this important discussion.
Thank you so much, Marissa, for that amazing bio and introduction. I love the part where you said you like lifting up the voices of the unheard. I love that. Okay, because for so long, those unheard voices have gone unheard to the point now that ears are just deaf. So we definitely need people like you. So thank you again for that awesome bio. Next, let's move on to Precious Leslie. Tell us a little bit about you, Precious. Precious, we cannot hear you. I cannot hear you. Is it just me?
Nope, that was the mute button and completely working.
I was looking at Marissa like, are you with me here? Can you hear her?
No. Just checking my mute button.
All right.
Making sure it's working all right. Yeah, so again, I am Precious Leslie, pronoun she, her. I am an ADHD, meaning autistic and ADHD adult. To most, it's probably very apparent that I'm an adult, but I feel that it's very important to include that piece in my bio, as many people in the general public, unfortunately, view especially autism as something that only impacts children. They fail to realize that we do grow up to become full-fledged adults ourselves. And so I definitely like to highlight that piece there. I am the principal consultant and founder of Loud Nerd, a full-service recruitment, marketing, and consulting firm with a focus on helping workers in general, but with a major focus on helping neurodivergent workers navigate the job search process and partnering with employers to create recruitment processes and workplace cultures that really embrace and celebrate neurodiversity, diversity in general, inclusion, equity, and the piece that's often left out, accessibility. And I'm very happy to join the panel today and talk about this very important topic.
Thank you so much, Precious, for that awesome introduction. I would also like, well, no, I'm sorry. You didn't introduce me. I mean, you introduced yourself, and that's what I meant. I'd like to point out the part where you said full-fledged adults, because I often talk about, I'm a school psychologist by trade, that students have IEPs that end in the 12th grade and then they become adults, and we behave as if the difficulties they did have and the accommodations that they did have are no longer required. Absolutely. After that. So thank you for that. Okay. And on to our next, last but not least, Gina. Introduce yourself to us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gina, and I go by the pronouns of she and her. Just up front, I am not a neurodivergent person, but please feel free to ask any questions or make any comments if you have something to add to it or correct. My area is in research on child development as well as lifespan development. And my dissertation will be covering autism, identity, and suicidality, and the belief in participatory research, narrative research, and involving autistics in all phases of research. I definitely support the nothing about us without us, which is the basic belief of my research.
Mhm.
I started out as a paraprofessional in 2000 at special education. I worked with everyone from study skills needs up into severe profound. In 2015, I worked as a paraprofessional in severe profound, and that is when I found my love for autism. And I had volunteered for the next year to work with a young lady who did have aggressive behavior and low verbal. So I decided to go back and I got my master's in special education with a certificate in autism, and then decided in the working world that what I would rather do is advocate. So my belief is through research, then I could advocate and help bring about supports and change into the equation.
Thank you so much, Gina, for that. The one thing I want to mention, Gina, is in your introduction, like when you said that you are not neurodivergent, I'm just getting a pen that works. I'm really sorry. I'm paying attention. When you mentioned in the beginning that you were not neurodivergent, the tone and the cadence in your voice kind of went down. That is not a bad thing. That is not a negative thing. That does not mean that you don't belong or that you don't fit in. We need you just as much as we need other neurodivergents. So
thank you. I just don't want to be an expert on something that I have not lived. And that's been one of the major problems within autism research.
And you know what?
So I
and
defer.
It means a lot that you prefaced yourself with acknowledging that to us. So I thank you for that. But I want to let you know, it doesn't matter. Okay, so now we're going to get on to the panel discussion. I'm going to give you a couple rules, okay? It's going to last 50 minutes. I have a little dry mouth. Okay, our panel discussion will last about 50 minutes, 12 minutes per question. Each participant will be given 4 minutes to respond to each question, okay? And don't worry, there is a little leeway. You'll be able to go over a little sometimes, but don't make a habit of it. But because we want to hear everything everyone has to say in its entirety. That's the only reason why. Once you reach your 3 minutes, I will hold my finger up, not the middle finger. Depends on what you said beforehand. Was that corny? Okay, I'm sorry. All right. I'm going to hold my finger up to let you know that you have 1 minute remaining and that you needed to wrap up what you were saying. Okay. All right. Question number 1, and this question will go to Marissa first. Are you ready, Marissa?
I am.
Okay. From your experience or expertise, does grief present differently in neurodivergent individuals? And if so, in what ways?
I think grief presents differently in everyone. It is highly individual, and there is no right way to grieve. For me, the stages of grief are a sliding scale up and down. But I want to answer this question in 3 parts, as in my life, I have experienced 3 main triggers of grief. I've experienced grief due to the loss of a loved one, grief due to the ending of friendships, and grief due to childhood experiences I missed out on because of my time sent away to the troubled teen industry.
Okay.
I have lost a lot of people I care for and love very much. As someone who is mostly extroverted, I make friends everywhere I go. But because I've spent so much time of my childhood and young adulthood in institutions, the sad reality is that many of the close friends I made there have died of suicide, complications from eating disorders, or fatal overdose. A lot of people don't understand what it's like to have lost so many people so young. Not only do I deal with the grief, but sometimes I have survivor's guilt, meaning I question why I'm here to tell my story and they are not. This is a trauma reflex. Oftentimes, I need to process my grief and be alone to let it all out privately. But oftentimes, I need someone to just sit with me or even distract me as a reprieve when I am grieving. A lot of neurotypical people don't know how to properly hold space for someone who is grieving, let alone a neurodivergent person with complex trauma. For me, grief doesn't hit right away. I tend to go numb in the beginning, and months later, I smell a scent, I hear a song that reminds me of the person who has passed, and I break down into tears and begin to really open the floodgates of my emotions. To many people, this isn't deemed normal to process and express grief so much later after the person has passed away, but it's just how my brain works. The initial shock of the loss is too overstimulating for me, and I tend to avoid it until I'm ready to process it. When dealing with the end of a friendship, I have to catch myself from ruminating on it too much. I have obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, which is very misunderstood. People have many incorrect assumptions as to the symptoms and types of OCD. I experience OCD through obsessive thoughts and compulsive rumination. When a friendship ends, I feel grief. That grief can present itself in resentment, detachment, temporary indifference, or overwhelming feelings of sadness. Sometimes I even feel like a failure when the friendship ends because society doesn't understand that some friendships aren't built to last forever. People grow apart, and this is normal, but it's not normalized. It's so important for me to make sure I catch the obsession with why the friendship ended and use my coping skills to not compulsively ruminate on all the things that could have been done differently. What helps me most is just sitting with the discomfort to the best of my ability and getting the discomfort out through movement, meditation, or simply crying as a release. If I can catch myself ruminating early on, I can process the grief in a way that is healing instead of harmful. And when it comes to grieving the loss of my childhood to the troubled teen industry, I express that grief by doing things that that my inner child would want me to do. This is an incredibly healing experience, but to some, expressing that inner child can be off-putting. I dye my hair fun colors, which some people view as a cry for help, when really I'm making my inner child feel seen. I watch shows I wasn't allowed to watch while institutionalized long term. I listen to edgy music that I couldn't listen to when institutionalized. In a way, these are not only ways I express my grief, but they are also ways I heal from the trauma of spending much of my teen years and early 20s in institutions. They allow me to express my grief while
Thank
also
you.
giving a hug to my inner child.
Thank you so much, Marissa. The one part that I wanted to mention that stood out to me was telling someone a time period on when they should grieve, that they need to grieve now and they should grieve for 2 to 6 weeks, and then the grieving process should be over. And that should be the normal process of grieving. I myself do not agree with that. I am neurodivergent, ADHD, among other things, I think. And I lost my father in December. And the grieving process, it hits hard in intervals. It's like an interval. Yeah, it's timed. So that really hit home. Precious, what are your views on the neurodivergent individuals, and from your experience or expertise, does grief present different in neurodivergent individuals? If it does, how so?
Yeah, so I would say 100% absolutely yes. Grief does definitely present very differently in neurodivergent individuals. For starters, neurodivergent individuals have neurological differences. Our brains are literally wired differently and interface with the inside and outside world very differently, which is obviously going to impact the way we experience everything in the world, including emotions, including grief. I do want to point out, though, that it is very important to understand that neurodivergent individuals, autistic individuals, we are not a monolith, just like anybody else. We're all individuals. We all have unique life experiences, beliefs and thoughts of our own. And we also process and experience emotions very differently. So I definitely like to highlight that part. But, in general, there do tend to be some commonalities amongst any particular demographic that we're talking about. One of the ways that neurodivergent individuals tend to present grief differently is emotional expression. We may present or behave, express our emotions in ways that differ widely from how a neurotypical individual would express those. For example, this may involve atypical emotional reactions. A lot of us have difficulty recognizing and verbalizing our feelings. This is a term called alexithymia. We may also have very intense emotional displays, sometimes so much so that they may seem to be out of proportion to others on the outside looking in. Also, we tend to have very different communication and social interaction differences. And that one in particular, I'm very much talking specifically about autistic individuals. This can lead to lots of communication challenges and misunderstandings, ultimately leading to additional undue stress and frustration on the part of the neurodivergent individual. Also, a lot of us tend to have sensory sensitivities, so things like, buzzing fluorescent lights, loud noises, crowds, even textile sensitivities. Are a lot of autistic individuals will have an affinity for routine that can be completely upended when you are navigating a time of grief. We may also have coping mechanisms that don't look recognizable to neurotypical individuals. I'll give you an example. You had mentioned that your father recently passed, and my condolences for that. I lost my father when I was 21, and I tend to try to jump in, protect my younger siblings, and do what I can to alleviate everyone else's burden when dealing with grief. And that doesn't always come off as grieving. It, may come off as needing to control the situation or things like that. But showing that love, putting that buffer there for my siblings was very important to my grieving process. Although, not everyone interpreted that way. And I was actually told by someone that I was working with at my father's bank. She's like, "Wow, your father just died yesterday. You're taking no time off to grieve and really deal with this. You're just jumping right into business." And that, getting that feedback hit me hard in that time, because that was part of how I was processing. That was part of how I was grieving, and helping my siblings to grieve in the way that they needed to.
for that. I thank you for that. The different ways that we grieve. I like how you talked about there's differences within our differences. So we're different, and then we're different within our different, but there's also likenesses that help us be good supports for one another. If we're aware and we feel comfortable enough to even show our grieving process. Gina, I want to get to you.
Yes, thank you. While I was looking up research on autism and grief and trauma, one of the most disconcerting things about it was that there is a paucity of research on autism and grief. What I found mainly, which is understandable from the research aspect, was the study of grief and mourning that parents experience when their child is diagnosed with autism. Now, from the research perspective, that's put in there, of course, because most research, in my opinion, has been taken into account how the parents feel. You know, the surveys are usually to the parents. And also, the depression does exist. Yet at the same time, there is such a dimension that is not being mentioned because the parents cannot necessarily communicate what it's like for their child. And it goes back to what Precious was saying, that alexithymia, I can never say it right. People either look at it as, you know, from neurotypical, that people don't feel, that have autism, and that there is a certain way to grieve. And if I may say, you have Kubler-Ross, who in her 1969 book on death and dying, she is the one who presented the neurotypical grief cycle. It was the 5 stages theory on grief, and the first was denial, then anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now, this is the model, as Precious was mentioned, people were expecting you to be following that. And so Carla Fisher, if anyone's ever heard of her, she came out with the meltdown model, and she discusses how it is experienced by a person who has autism, that a cycle is completely different. And just to share a story of lived experience from my daughter, she is 20 years old. She was diagnosed with nonverbal learning disability, and they do not have that in the DSM manual, and that's okay because they get things wrong anyway. It is very similar to Asperger's in that there is spatial versus verbal and communication. The difference is that her spatial is very skewed, even more so than with Asperger's. So I present that to explain the difference. When my mother died in 2014, Heidi was 7, and they were the best of friends, even though my mother lived in Florida and we live in Georgia. My mom loved the internet, and they would, you know, go online and virtually play games. And, you know, my daughter would keep her on there for a couple hours, like, Mom, let's play our own games. And, you know, we'll just do it different, but always kept her on there. And when she was in hospice, my daughter was, granted, she was 11, but she was not connecting, you know, what was going on as my mother was in the other room in bed and in oxygen. So around 14 years old, there was a lot going on with bullying at school and so forth. And that is when she began to really understand that my mom was not there. So, yes, 1 minute.
No, you're fine. Keep going. I'm just letting you know.
Okay. So she would have to have my mom's bookmark that we had at the funeral and her fingerprint necklace. And then I had one of the biggest surprises of my life, and it wasn't a good one. My mother's anniversary of her passing is on September 10th. And in 2020, on September 10th, my daughter at 17 years old kept saying she wanted to talk to me about something. And I thought, okay, she's repeating that something's wrong. And she informed me that she wanted to go be with Mama. So, yes. And in 2020, you could imagine how hard it was to get into a pediatric facility. And it took a few days staying in the ER. So I present that to show just the longevity and in her age as well. And she was 17 then when it hit her and she had the suicidality. And that's the part that I really, really want to focus on, is how the trauma and autism and the autistic traits within themselves and how it can lead to the suicidality, even though it's years down the road.
Wow. I can definitely appreciate the correlation that you just expressed to us. Prior to this, I had never heard of such a correlation, but I can definitely see within my own grief. Since my father has passed, it seems like every interval, each one, it gets deeper and deeper, and I don't know what to do. And I want to help everybody. And I want to help my mother. And I'm the person who is similar to the person in the last Batman or the last Joker movie, who is always laughing and kidding and joking at times when people should be normally crying and practicing a lot of sorrow. So, needless to say, it's been very difficult, and you individuals have helped me very much tonight already. Okay. Question 2. Now, Precious, I'm going to begin with you with question 2. What stereotypes or stigmas, and I think we've already kind of touched on this, what stereotypes or stigmas might different NDs experience around grief, and how might they affect the grieving process?
Yeah, so I think the stereotypes and stigmas are gonna vary a bit depending on, I guess, what flavor of neurodiversity we're talking about. But I will say all stereotypes and stigmas definitely have a massive impact on the grieving process, adding additional layers of challenge and stress.
Could you maybe name some of the different stigmas that you've either studied or experienced yourself or seen?
Yeah, so let's take, being autistic, for example. There's a stereotype that autistic people can be emotionally detached or incapable of expressing empathy or sympathy. I can tell you that's very much not the case for most of us. Many of us are actually extremely empathetic. I definitely myself identify as an empath. I feel very strong, intense empathy. I will give anybody in need anything that I can, including the shirt off my back. And so, my personal belief is that that is a common stereotype about autistic people, because we tend to communicate and express emotions in a way that don't necessarily look like sympathy or empathy to a neurotypical person, leading to that misunderstanding of where we are with that. You had mentioned being ADHD and laughing, and I'm like, oh my gosh, can I relate? I am the queen of using laughter as medicine.
Yes.
I not only have experienced grief in the form of loss, I've also, had a very traumatic childhood. We experienced homelessness several times growing up. My family went without many times, and so there were some dark days, and we definitely, as a sibling group, got good at making the best of a dark situation and finding the humor to maintain our sanity. And comedy, laughing, is a very important piece of that. And so, like you were highlighting, that can look inappropriate to someone who doesn't understand that that is a way of processing grief, for many of us. And yeah, so it's going to look different all around, but these stereotypes and stigmas, it's going to have a massive impact on one's ability to process grief. It could lead to isolation. Neurodivergent individuals might isolate themselves for, fear of judgment, exhaustion from dealing with trying to overcome those stereotypes and stigmas. It's going to lead to a lot of misunderstandings, which can also cause individuals to have difficulty accessing support, not only from friends, families, social groups, but also professional support, when they've encountered those stereotypes and stigmas in a professional setting, say like with a psychiatrist or a therapist. Often it's going to lead to heightened stress, delayed healing when an individual is not allowed to process their grief or any heavy emotion in the way that they need to. It's going to prolong that healing process, which can lead to things like PTSD, and more issues down the line. So yeah.
Thank you so much for that. It's funny you should say that because the first thing I thought of when you said, like we try to hide our emotions because they're viewed as not appropriate. But I know families that have, hide the divergent, like, so, he doesn't or she doesn't know how to behave at these settings or in these settings. So stay here. Okay. And then, like you said, it stunts that person's grieving process. They can't uh, move throughout that process. So, it's just a sad occurrence when people allow ignorance to dictate uh, their actions and how they treat others. Next, Gina, what are your thoughts on the stigma and stereotypes of different of indies?
Thank you. Precious did mention the ones that I had written down that are, pretty much misconstrued by others. And one of the things I wanted to add to that is the processing space that is available when it comes to emotionality. There's only so many emotions that can be taken in as at one time, and as Precious mentioned, it's sensory too. Things are coming in and out, but my area is on the suicidality of that. And one of the stigmas that really go into that is, as we all know, as camouflaging, but it can also be called masking. And I have a book here that I hope a lot of people have seen. It's Unmasking Autism. Yay. Okay. And there's so much into understanding that the masks that neurotypicals experience are totally different than what masks are put on for minorities, for those who are disabled or neurodivergent, and it's because it affects their whole self-identity. If I go to work and I put on, my work hat, that may be masking. I can't act the way I act at home, which I usually do anyway, but that kind of mask isn't affecting my self-identity. And one of the important factors when it comes to the self-identity is the need for connectedness. As I study identity itself, and you have Erikson's identity theory that is helpful within the research, is that there are so many factors that come into our identity, whether it's self, whether it's social, a group, and without that connectedness, who is there for you? And if we rely on neurotypicals to understand that, who have no background or simply won't sit and listen, it's important to have that group aspect where you have that safe space that you need. And it goes back to the grief and identity and suicidality. You look at it, one article that was published in 2014 found that the higher functioning, which I know that's not a great phrase in it, but it is 2014 that is written, is that
Gina,
they were,
can you save that for our next round? Question 3, because you are out of time. Okay.
I'll save that.
Stay there, because a lot of everything that you said was very beneficial. I know the one thing that stood out to me was the fact that what you said, I can't repeat it exactly, but what popped into my mind was white women are allowed to cry and Black women are not. Yeah. Boom. That's exactly what popped into my mind. And I said to myself, I remember when I wanted to cry, it wasn't accepted for various reasons, but that was one of the reasons. Oh, get over it. You're strong.
Yes, and it does go back to the resilience model of African American women.
Yes, very much so.
Yes, it's the resilience.
Talk about that for days. Oh, I'm gonna have to get your number. Okay, all right. Okay, next, Marissa, what do you have for us on the stereotypes or stigmas that different NDs might experience around grief?
Well, just as there is no perfect survivor of trauma, there is no such thing as a perfect way to grieve. As a neurodivergent person, I feel overstimulated and overwhelmed by the emotions that come with grief. This can cause me to shut down, act out, become angry or depressed, or a myriad of other things. People often expect me to keep my chin up and grieve in ways that are socially appropriate. But this socially appropriate approach is harmful and it's ableist, and it doesn't make space for neurodivergent people to grieve in a way that is cathartic and makes sense for them. Our society doesn't hold space for the roller coaster of grief. Often when we express grief, we're seen as a burden for wanting to express that grief to someone. We're seen as damaged for taking longer time than is socially appropriate to process the grief and to come to terms with it. There needs to be a universal understanding that people experience grief in different ways and at their own pace. An example of this is the time I laughed at a socially inappropriate time at a friend's funeral. I was so overwhelmed with grief and was giving a eulogy, which I was so nervous to give, that I had to hide my laughter as coughing and drink water. As a neurodivergent person with trauma and many friends like me, I have learned that laughing at a funeral is actually not that uncommon. My therapist explained that it's a trauma reflex in which the brain is protecting me from the overstimulation of the grief. It is also an expression of grief by itself. Crying and laughing are both ways the body releases toxic stress with grief, and I believe the social norms on how someone acts at a funeral or when they're experiencing grief need to be made less ableist. Obviously, I can excuse myself if it becomes distracting to others, but I wish people would understand why I sometimes laugh when I'm grieving. It's not because it's funny, it's because I'm so overwhelmed and overstimulated that my body is simply reacting.
So, Can you give us some other examples of how a neurodivergent individual may react that is different along the lines of like laughing at a funeral? Or there's some other ways that you've seen or you've yourself?
I think another example would be someone not quite being ready to process that grief and almost acting as though it's not affecting them, when really underneath the surface it's really affecting them. And really it helps when someone truly takes the time to ask, how are you really?
Mm-hmm. And a lot of times, and that means a lot, because I remember one time a boss told me, when I ask people, how are you feeling? I don't really want to know how you're feeling. I just want you to say, like good, bad, or have a good day, or I'm doing good. And I'm like, well, then you shouldn't ask that question, because there are some individuals, okay, because the question you are asking, it wants an answer. It's begging for that answer. And there are people who want to give you that answer and who need to give you that answer. Okay. Especially at that time, maybe. So, thank you, ladies, for those awesome answers to question 2. We're going to go on to question 3, and we're going to begin with Gina here. Do you believe trauma plays a role in grief? If so, do you see it as a separate emotion or feeling, or do you feel that trauma is intertwined within the grieving process?
From what I have read, when we look at the trauma and polyvictimization, trauma takes so many forms. And once you've been traumatized in various areas, that begins to build up. And as was stated before, the idea that trauma and grief only have to do with death or a significant, huge happening, what winds up being the neurotypical looking in on neurodivergent is to tell them you're overreacting. This is something that's not that big of a deal. Come on, it's been 7 years. It's been 8 years. You should be through that process already. But you have trauma based on trauma, and when there is one of the researchers put it as a reactive loss of communication. When you can't communicate those feelings, you don't have a safe haven. Now you've built another trauma on that grief. And looking at the past experiences and then the reactions that, all of us in our mind, they all have links to it. But if you haven't dealt with the traumas that have occurred before, in grief, there could be many traumas at the same time. Yes. When you are grieving one thing, there are many. And, there are the grief reactions that people don't feel like they belong because they don't respond the same way. And if we take the time, it all goes back to me to take the time to listen. We have what is a huge problem right now, which is double empathy. There's no reciprocity. Everyone is expected to match the neurotypical model of how everything is done. You should speak the same way. You should react the same way. You should think the same way. Well, where is that reciprocity? Why isn't there an understanding that within neurodiversity, there are many different ways to operate? Mm-hmm. So instead of making that other, we need to bring that together. And how are we going to know the traumas behind the newest trauma, which can come up in that grief, if we simply do not sit back and listen? And that is another area where there is a research gap, and that's mainly due to the fact that autistics are not included in the research, and now there is a push for autobiographical, autoethnographical, which is the lived experience of the researcher. And we need that. We need the narrative. All of these narratives, you think of primary documents, how much does it add to read a diary, to understand where a person is coming from? And so the inclusivity on that, just hearing the trauma from the beginning, it needs to be an open door, and it's not going to be handled in one session. And like I said, it all goes back to me is pulling the people who have that lived experience into research, that the model that is neurotypical, like Kubler-Ross, the 5 stages of grief, doesn't include how neurodiversity affects that.
Thank you, Gina. One of the things that I can relate to when it comes to the trauma, oh my goodness, I'm really sorry, guys. Excuse me, everyone. One of the things that I can relate to is my stepsister, had a serious injury. She lives in Chicago, and on the subway, she slipped on the ice and had a very bad fall, hit the back of her head. My sister's personality is completely different. I don't know who she is. She has this traumatic brain injury now, and her everything is so different. So of course she's processing my dad's death different. She's looking at me different because everything that I'm doing is new to her. So there's a lot of struggles going on right now, and a lot of understanding and listening and processing and understanding that needs to happen. Marissa, you're next. Do you believe trauma plays a role in grief? And if so, do you see it as a separate emotion or is it intertwined?
For me, trauma and grief tend to be intertwined. For starters, I think grief and loss are forms of trauma on their own. For me personally, every time I lose a loved one, I'm reminded of all the loved ones I've lost before them. One loss can reopen old wounds, and it can be hard not to fixate on all of them at once. It's a flooding of emotion. This is why it's so important for me to have a trauma therapist to help me untangle the web of my thoughts and emotions and make sense of them. It helps me understand myself and my grieving process. It helps me heal and begin to accept the loss. But as I stated in my answer to a previous question, for me, the stages of grief are a sliding scale. Sometimes I am in a place of acceptance, and sometimes I fall into anger, sadness, and feel that hole in my life where that loved one or that childhood that I lost used to be or should have been. This is completely normal. I think the idea that acceptance is a final stop in grieving is false. I believe we have moments or periods of time where we are in a place of acceptance and moments where acceptance simply is not accessible. When I grieve the parts of my life that I lost to institutional child abuse within the troubled teen industry, it's often difficult to separate the trauma from the grief of what I never got to experience. I missed walking at my high school graduation despite graduating. I missed my senior prom. I missed my entire senior year of high school. I will never get that important developmental stage of my life back. While trauma and grief are intertwined for me and have overlapping emotions, they're often a little different in nature once I dig through the surface. This is why I'm so grateful to have a trauma specialist, and I wish so badly that access to trauma-informed care was accessible to all, regardless of financial circumstances. Accessible mental health care is a basic human right that I believe should be given freely to all. And I advocate for this on a daily basis and won't stop advocating for it until everyone can access the care, supports, and resources that they need.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you again. That is so vital. There are so many of us out there that are not able to have someone on the outside assist us in any way due to the fact of insurance, due to the fact of financial and socioeconomic status. One of the things I want to bring up is when you said you had to work with that trauma counselor. I want minorities and minority families to know and to realize that it is okay to talk to a counselor. It is okay to talk to someone else outside of your home or your family. Sometimes you need that. Sometimes you need that understanding. Sometimes you need that professional. Sometimes you just need someone to listen to you scream and swear about your family. You need that. Okay. Alrighty. So now, Precious, I am so sorry. We ended the last question, right?
Nope. We're
on Precious.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Do you believe trauma plays a role in grief? And if so, do you see it as separate or do you believe it's intertwined?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think that trauma indeed can play a significant role in grief. I also believe that the relationship between trauma and grief is very complex. I do think they're closely interconnected and often influence each other throughout the healing process. I also think that trauma can amplify and complicate grief. I'll say on this topic of trauma and grief, I would be remiss not to bring this up, especially Selena, your comment earlier when you were talking, Gina had mentioned autistic masking. And you were like, yep, got it. Yeah, I have never once spoken to a person of color and explained what masking is, and they weren't immediately able to see the similarities between autistic masking and code switching. And they're like, yep, been there. I understand the exhaustion. I understand the mental toll it can take. And that kind of got me thinking on the connection of trauma and grief, that many autistic individuals, especially women, especially women of color, are, for many reasons, and that's a whole other conversation about our healthcare in this country, but we tend to be diagnosed later in life, much later in life. I personally was in my early 30s before I got diagnosed. So if you can imagine spending 30 plus years masking and code switching, and the burden and the toll that it takes on one, and that
it's exhausting.
Yes, it's a prolonged trauma. You don't get the accommodations and the supports that are needed. You don't even understand yourself. You don't understand why you behave and process things in the way that you do for that long. Is its own form of trauma. It directly relates to the horrible suicide rates that autistic individuals face. Our average life expectancy is 54 years. That is far too short. And so, when we're talking about neurodivergent individuals and trauma, I'm like, yeah, there's no unwinding trauma and grief, in my opinion. So
thank you so much, Precious, for that. We're going to move on to question 4, because I think that everything said does not need to be reiterated. It was powerful and strong in itself. What are some strategies? And this one, I'm going to throw out like a ping pong ball. Don't make me call your name out. and like a whole, like if I get the whole like dead silence. Okay. All right. So the first question is, the question is, what are some strategies you might be able to provide in navigating grief? And whoever wants to jump right in.
The first one that comes to mind for me, I will say, is giving yourself permission to grieve in the way that you need to grieve, and don't let other people's nonsense like steer you in the wrong direction. I've done that far too many times, and it's delayed that grieving process. And so just really doing what you need to do to grieve and process in the way that you need to, and knowing that there's no right way to grieve. No one's a grief expert, especially when it comes to you. So
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Next.
I can go next.
Okay.
Don't be afraid to lean on those who love you, and don't be ashamed to ask for accommodations at your place of employment or your school. You're not a burden, and accommodations should be much easier to access in American society than they currently are. And remember that grief isn't just linear stages, it can be a sliding scale, as it is for me. I'm often surprised at how losses from many years ago pop up with smelling a scent or hearing a song. Sometimes I feel angry. Sometimes I feel like the loss happened all over again. Grief never really goes away, but we do learn to live with it with time, self-compassion, and by creating new happy memories that almost surround the hole that is the grief. Time to grieve when necessary is essential. Sometimes I put on sad, nostalgic music, set a timer, and cry for 15 to 30 minutes. Once the timer goes off, I self-soothe using skills I learned in therapy and regulate myself and my emotions. Each time I release the emotions of grief, I feel so much lighter after. I also find it helpful to find out where in my body I experience the grief. Is it in my hips, head, legs, jaw? This is all important information for me to take in and learn for future processing. It also helps to lean on my husband, my friends, and my family, and speaking up about how I feel and not feeling ashamed to ask for help or support is critical to my well-being. If you need support, I encourage you to ask a trusted loved one or professional. No one is a burden for going through a hard time or going through the grieving process.
Thank you so much, Marissa. And the only thing you forgot is the chocolate chip cookie dough ice cream during that sad music and bawling for 15 minutes.
Ben and Jerry's win.
Okay. Gina.
Okay, I wanted to read a quote by a gentleman, Edward Finney. He writes an autoethnographical account of losing his mother, and that goes back to the researcher telling their life story, and it's though the earth gives way. And one of the quotes that I'm quoting him, that really summed up to me what grief is. He writes, "Grief by its nature is contradictory. On the one hand, it is a complex and painful maelstrom of thoughts and emotions triggered by losing someone precious. On the other hand, it is a natural and positive healing process that plays an essential role in helping us work through and hopefully let go of the often unavoidable trauma of loss." And that, I think, sums up what the stages for each individual going through them, that it can be therapeutic. It may take longer. It may be a shorter version of grief. Within the research of suicidality with autism, one of the biggest challenges is that the assessment systems are made for neurotypicals. So while CBT is wonderful therapy to help through trauma and grief, there needs to be modification done to understand, because if you do an assessment on PTSD or depression, it's not the same. We need to move past those models. And Dodds, in one of his research articles, wrote that the needs, preferences, and abilities of autistics in developing and adapting therapeutic approaches is what's needed. How do we create therapy? How do we create approaches to give the room for expression and not have to mask, to go in there and think you have to act a certain way or say the right thing, or they're going to send you to inpatient. That should not.
And that's exactly what ND23 is trying to do, Gina, trying to get these institutions and these different workplaces and schools and you name it, to change the way that they are delivering their services. I mean, they're delivering their services one way, and we all come in an array, so it's not matching anymore. It has been amazing. It has been absolutely amazing being in the midst of you powerful, smart humans. Okay, because I still don't want to mess up. I thank you very much for all your expertise on grief. I'm telling you right now that a lot of things that you said hit home to me tonight, and I'm going to go research in my own grieving process. Thank you. Thank you, Marissa. Thank you, Gina. And thank you, Precious.
And I wanted to say thank you for helping me to have the insight that I need more of.
Awesome. Thank you. Good night. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all. What an amazing panel with so many amazing perspectives. First off, thank you all for your vulnerability and openness. You are all so strong and courageous to relive and retell perhaps some of the most painful moments, memories, and experiences. And your voices are just so powerful to this conversation, and your insights, knowledge, and experiences are very much appreciated. So I just wanted to thank you all for being vulnerable and for being open in this conversation. I also wanted to thank you for taking the time to share your insights and expertise with us today. So thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. And to everyone who joined us, if you would like to participate in future events, or if you want to volunteer, advise, or apply for board positions, the links are in the comments. Thank you again for being here, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.